Well, welcome everyone to OTel Q&A, and thanks Dan for joining us for OTel Q&A, especially on we got you on such short notice.
Oh,
I'm glad we were able to squeeze you in for October,
me
especially
too.
KubeCon is coming up in November, so for folks who are going, a few of us will be there. Reese, Dan, and I will be there from the OTel end user SIG, so gonna be busy.
Yeah, it's going to be busy. Where is that happening, by the way? Just
It's
out of
in Salt
curiosity.
Lake City.
Salt Lake City.
Mm,
Nice. I've never been there myself personally, but
yeah, me neither. Me neither.
oh, oh, so this will be a new experience for you too.
Yeah, yeah, looking forward.
Exciting, exciting. I start asking you questions. I realize I'm the one here who's supposed to be answering the questions. So I'll put the brakes on for a
Buckle up,
moment.
folks. It's going to be a fun one.
Oh yeah. Not sure
All
about
right.
informative, but it will be fun.
Well, here we go. Okay, let's start with the questions. So, Dan, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Hello, I am Dan Ravenstone. I am a staff engineer at Top Hat. I've been there for, I guess, 2.5 years, maybe no, a little bit longer than that. Come May, I think it'll be three. A little of my background. I have been doing monitoring and observability for the bulk of my technical career. I started back in where I actually this, and I usually refer to it as like where the monitoring bug bit me, was when I was at a company called Affilius, which was at Yonge and 401 area in Toronto. Affilius managed the .info.org domain registry in the back end of it for back in the day. And I had started there in tech support, but then I one day opened up my big mouth and said, "Hey, listen, I'm tired of our customers calling us up and telling us our stuff is down. Can we fix this?" And so they said, "Well, then you asked for it, you get it." So I went out, and that's how I started learning about monitoring tools. And that's back in the day of Big Brother, Nagios, Cacti, all those fun things. And I just loved it. This kind of like, I think one of the things I liked about monitoring in those days was that, like, I liked looking for patterns. I liked detective novels. I liked all this fun things. And what this did was like kind of allow for somebody to kind of like be in the front lines in the operations and dive in and find problems and report them back. And then like the better your monitoring tools were, the more likely you're able to follow and find the problems a lot sooner before they become actually customer impact. And that was always been my kind of like push when I did this. And of course, as things progressed and monitoring changed, we got into the wonderful world of observability and a whole different way of looking at it. And I fell in love with that obviously as well, and tried to grow with the times and see how being proactive is a lot better than being reactive, which is kind of like you would think is an obvious thing, but it takes a lot of people time to kind of get their heads wrapped around. So yeah, that is kind of how I got into this part of the world, and a little bit about me. There's tons of other things, but we don't want to go into those because then we'll get lost in the weeds and we'll never get out and we'll be lost forever.
Sounds good. Well, thanks. And like you've been in this for a while, like when it started out with monitoring, evolved into observability. What kinds of like big changes have you seen in the course of that time?
Uh, Let me start off with the things I haven't seen change, which is still a problem. Alerting.
Okay.
Alerting still has not changed, surprisingly. Um, but what has changed, and I think this is one of the things that we're trying to get to. I focus on alerting because I was giving by myself time to think what has changed. So now that you know my secret, I just taught myself a couple more minutes. So, but what has changed though in observability and in the open telemetry, especially too, is it allowed for us to actually look at our services a lot differently. Where monitoring was kind of a very largely reactive kind of thing, and we only had the symptoms of what was going on. So if everybody has ever used Nagios, is well aware of the sort of out of the box host monitoring sort of plugins you usually include, which is like your CPU, your memory, your disk space. And these things have been carried throughout time and to constantly be indicators of a problem. But that's usually not quite the case anymore, is it? Especially when we have Kubernetes and containers and other tools now that these things shouldn't really play a role in us. And so it's like more like, so what else is impacting the service? And we never really had that ability to look at it until we started sort of aggregating our logs. And even when we aggregated our logs, it was still strangely problematic because we had guidelines on how to do structured logging and that kind of thing, but still people would do their own thing and things were never. And so even with all the good documentation and sort of best practice wrapped around it, logs were still problematic. And again, you still have to still collect a bunch of data before you can actually understand, oh, wait a minute, this is a problem before actually kind of knowing beforehand. What observability has done or has taught us is how to sort of like set things up in a more of a way that we're looking at it as an overall user experience. And we don't get sort of sucked into minutia sometimes. And because there's a lot of red herrings in operations when especially when you're in the middle of an incident, you're looking at all this data and you're like, what is the actual problem? We have high CPU over here and we have slow load times over here. We have latency here. We have some errors here, but which one of these is the smoking? I don't want to use a gun, but for lack of a better word, smoking gun, right? And I see that with observability has changed how we look at that. However, that's for probably this group. A lot of people are familiar with it. There's a whole world of engineers out there who are still trying to get their heads wrapped around this concept. And this is why I'm kind of glad we have these conversations. And I try to get those people. This is targeted towards them of why this is so important, why you need to start looking at this because there's a number of good things. One, you know what the user is experiencing, and that's all that matters. And if you know what the user is experiencing, that means you can translate that to how much you're making. Like very, very, like very, it's a cost thing and it's a money thing. If you know if your users are happy, that means you're making money because they're going to be spending money because they're going to keep using your service. If they're not happy, they're not going to be using your service and they're going to walk away and use something else or just not use it that often and try to avoid as much as possible. That means you're not going to be making the money. Anyway, and I'm going to get in the weeds. So you're going to hear me say that a lot because I just do. So Adrian, it's all up to you to rope me back in. Like you gotta.
Don't worry, no worries. But I do want to you said something really interesting in terms of translating it in terms of money because like observability adoption, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I like what you said. In terms of observability adoption, like it's as much a top-down thing as a bottom-up thing. And one
Yeah,
way to speak to the benefits of observability is in dollars and cents, and executives speak in dollars and cents. So proving the worth of having an observable system, I think becomes really, really important.
yeah,
And being
I
able to
agree.
use that language with executives to be able to convince them, I think is very valuable. So
And that's what I've been trying to focus more on. And like there's quantifiable reasons why to look at this. We can do that. Why observability actually, excuse me, provides value to us at the end of the day. But I think we're still, I think we're still trying to get that figured out. I feel like um, anyway, you know what? Before we jump in, let's keep moving forward because I could go into a whole other area here, and I don't know. I don't want to sort of suck a lot of time in there, but it is one of those things I think that is worth having conversations, not with just those in the community, but also talk. Like, I mean, if you're out there, find out what the observability sort of platform or the concepts are at where you work. What are the drivers? Why aren't you doing it? Why aren't you using these things? And ask those questions. And then that could help and feed that back to the community because that could help us build up the reasons why you should be doing this because it does make better sense eventually. But yeah, that's a sort of a general call to anyone who's out there who wants to sort of get going on this and need help.
yeah, I completely agree. And I think this takes us to our next question, which is like you've done this for a while now, like first
Mhm.
the monitoring space, now moving into the observability space. What do you think are some of the main challenges that most organizations are facing these days when it comes to observability?
Uh, there's a lot of challenges, and I've been trying to get my head wrapped around some of this stuff. One is communication, I think. So some of I think it's mostly cultural, really, if you think about I mean, there's not a technical reason why people shouldn't go to this other than resourcing and time. And I mean, this might be jumping ahead of it a little bit, but where I am right now, we are using a current vendor, which will remain nameless, but we use a current vendor right now for our monitoring observability purposes. But we're getting away from them because of the library we're using is a vendor specific. And that means that we're basically, when it comes to doing any kind of telemetry, it has to use that particular library and theirs only. And that's one challenge, because if you think about, like, okay, so you're using this one vendor, it's cost you X amount per month or per year, and it's exorbitant. However, to translate or get off of that one and go into another one where you have more options, like with OpenTelemetry, takes time. It's not like like anybody who's ever gone on any kind of migration from one tool to another knows how long it takes. And you have to have a few things in place to actually say why you should do this. So one is, like, of course, obviously the cost, right? Well, but it's hard for some executives to say, well, we're spending this, but it'll cost us this much to get over here, and then we'll see the cost value. So there's this huge challenge of just trying to shift things over, spend the time to do it, and then do it in a properly. And that's a whole other challenge. It's like, okay, yeah, doing OpenTelemetry is one thing, but doing it properly, like every other software or any other tool that you have out there, you have to still use it for the right reasons and do it properly. If you don't, you'll still run into issues. And whatever you're trying to sort of get away from over here might come up in a different way over here. So that's one of the challenges, is just just doing the whole shift over. I think that's where a lot of people, and they don't know how to do it. And what happens too is then they do a shift, they try it out, and then they get burned for it because, they don't know how to do sampling or something like that. And then they feed it off to some tool, like, let's say, a tool that you get charged by event volume. Even though they're using OTel, they still became like, oh, I saw one company who did that. They start shifting, using OTel, but they start sending all this volume, all this data to it. They didn't do it right. They were having like 100,000 spans per trace, which is a huge amount. And they weren't really getting a lot of value, and their costs are soaring. And so it's like, well, then they kind of just drop and they go, well, we'll figure it out another way, and we'll just use some other tools to figure out when there's problems with our service, which is sort of like a defeatist kind of attitude, but it does happen because they don't, because there's a lot of work involved. Doing this is more than just a simple lift and shift. It's a lot more involved to it. Trying to think of other challenges. Like those, that to me is like some of the bigger challenges, and I think a lot of people could probably emphasize with that one as well. There are others, obviously, but I mean, we don't have a whole lot of time, and then we could probably go on. Just you and I alone, I bet you we both have experiences on some of those other challenges we have to experience. But I mean, uh, I like to see, like how do we get past that? It's kind of like where I want to target. How do we get past these challenges and move forward? Which I don't have a proper answer to, but I will want to talk about it.
You touched upon something that I think is worth mentioning as well, which is moving away from like vendor libraries to open telemetry, because even though I think one of the wonderful things about open telemetry is that it's vendor neutral. And so it makes it, once you've moved all of your instrumentation to that, super easy to switch vendors. I would say relatively easy, right? Because they're still
It's
like
relatively
on,
easy.
yeah, like at least from the instrumentation standpoint, it makes it super easy.
Yes.
But it's the challenge though is convincing folks to move away from those vendor libraries. And I think that becomes a bit of a sticking point, because it's like they you need to move away from them because maybe that vendor's too expensive and you don't want to go with them and you want to try something fresh. But
Mhm.
there's
All right.
so
Yeah.
much time and effort and learning curve, all that stuff associated with re-instrumenting. Have you
And that, yeah.
what are your thoughts around that?
Well, and that's a very, very powerful point you're making, because first off, with vendor libraries, you get in the habit of doing things a certain way, right? And so again, I do not want to. There's no like, but the thing is, so some vendors may do things one way, but is not part of the industry standard or the best practice we see across the industry. So they may like name things a certain way or do things a certain way, and people get used to that. So not only is it just shifting a library over, if it was just a matter of shifting a library to one to the other, that's in itself is a challenge. But there's also all the behavior that gets attributed to using that older library. That some for some things you got to go, well, listen, you don't need to look at it like that anymore. You need to look at it like this now. And so it's not just a technical shift, it's also a cultural shift in how they even like envision how their service is working with the new library, with using OpenTelemetry. Because OpenTelemetry is current, it's trying to it's adding new things as we speak, as every day. We're seeing a lot more love now for mobile, which is wonderful. I'm so excited to see some of that because I feel that's largely been ignored for a long time. But we're seeing these things getting pulled together, and we're having this, and it's kind of like keep following these sort of patterns and following these standards, and so that make forces the developers to think a certain way. So a lot of them are not used to that yet. A lot of them still want to develop, and I realized one of the things I noticed too was for developers' perspective. I don't. Adriana, you're a coder by nature, right? Like that's kind of
Yeah.
where, yeah.
Yeah, that's my
So when
background.
you,
Yeah.
yeah, that's your back. So it's not mine, but I know that when I did do some coding, though, I would always print a line at certain parts in my code. Okay, where am I at? So
Yep. Oh
you're
yeah.
even like logging is kind of part of your local development experience,
Totally.
right? Now we're telling them don't worry so much about logging, use instrumentation. Well, you still have to have a mechanism for them to actually print that to screen, and so it's just changing how they even develop in the beginning. And that's I think where we're facing some challenges there is that it's not just it's technical, it's cultural, it's about even how what you've been taught in the universities and how you're even taught how to develop is changing a little bit. And not everybody's quick to embrace change. Not and especially when you've got your CEO or your features team or product team saying, we need this out now. Well, you're not going to worry about trying to learn a new way of doing things and oh well, now how my service is working from open telemetry perspective. It's like, well, I just need to get this out. So I'll just slap these log lines in, boom, gone. It passed, and we're going now it's in production and we'll move on, right? So there's that it's that kind of like also encouraging and supporting our developers to have the time to learn this and work with it so they can actually use it to their benefit and perhaps be able to do better code before it even hits staging or development. And then once it's in production, you know how it should be based on all your stuff. But it's getting that linking those people together, getting them to work together in that thinking that's a huge challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And getting them used to, as you said, like the nuances of, instrumenting with OpenTelemetry, which OpenTelemetry wants to standardize how you're doing like your main signals in a certain
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
right? Which, as you said, may be different from how you've been used to doing it, whether it's like through your print statements or vendor libraries or whatever.
It's kind of like, so I back in the day, this might be pre a lot of folks, I don't know, but I used to work with a lot with SNMP. And what I liked about SNMP was it was basically a protocol that was agreed upon by the community and it was very basic. But even then, and I saw this with logging too, but even with SNMP, I would still come across MIBs. I would still cross across libraries that were not properly done. So it required me, even like because I knew it, I would have to go in and kind of redo maybe a MIB so I can translate the OID properly. So when it goes into our or create a MIB because it wasn't available, it just had these OIDs that were available from an interface or something, and you just had to guess what they were. Um, Even with standards in place like that, something that's been in our sort of part of our industry for so long, no longer really being used anymore. Um, well, actually, still is by network devices, but that's not. Hopefully, we don't have to worry about that right now. Um, is that even with those things in place, it still takes time for people to even then there's still mistakes and things happen. So with a new thing like OpenTelemetry and then being setting standards, it's taking a long time for people to understand the how to use it, to do it, to set it up properly, and what get their most value out of that instrumentation, the most value out of using that from the beginning of the development cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about specifically the challenges that you're facing currently in your role when it comes to observability.
Oh, observability, not my own mental health problems. Okay, that's different. um, yeah. So my challenges have pretty much always been. I feel like it's always been the same. It's communication, and not because I'm. My challenge for me. So I've been in this business for a while. So what happens sometimes is I make the mistake, or make the assumption that folks know what I'm talking about. And I have to be careful sometimes. Like I can have these conversations with many people in the same community as like within the monitoring and observability community, and we could go on for hours about little nuances of something, whatever it may be, about logging or tracing, anything like that, and we can go on and talk about that ad nauseum. However, when you're talking to other people and you talk about basic things like the red method, so rate of errors, rate of requests, duration of requests, which is a very basic kind of concept within monitoring world, and which has helped kind of like we see a lot in even within observability too, to a certain degree. Uh, People don't understand that. You make the assumption that they actually kind of look at things in that light, but they don't. They still look at it from the old school, and then like honestly, like at some places I've been, it's like they still see CPU as a indicator of a performance problem, but it shouldn't be, in my opinion. It should, because that's not, CPU is cheap. You can get more, so that should be a scaling problem. Make sure you're scaling properly. You should be good. However, I make the assumption people know what I'm talking about. And that's one thing is I got to, so I have to constantly be patient and communicate the same message over and over again to make sure they understand, because people, even if I tell them 2 or 3 times, they still don't clue in. I had one conversation with one engineer for about a month. And it took a month for them to actually understand what I was driving at. And this is like, because they were in different time zones, so that's why it took a little bit longer. But it took a while before they actually understood. Oh, that's what you meant. And as soon as they were able to make that change, everything was working better. And oh, now I see where you're driving at. I now see the point you're trying to make. And it's just, you have to be diligent, you have to be patient, you have to communicate, and you have to change how you communicate sometimes too. Like you just can't say the same words over. You have to rethink. Okay, you're not getting what I'm saying. What will help you understand, and then try to reword it so people understand. You met my friend Damien, who I work with. He's actually the same place as I am, but Damien, who also works with me on a lot of stuff, and he's more of he has a different background, but he sometimes steps in and sort of translate what I'm saying, because sometimes it helps to have a different, because he puts a different spin on it, and also, oh, now I get it. So those are some of the biggest things I find to today are still the biggest sort of, people get it. It's just a matter of but it's just getting them, just lead the horse to water type thing, right? But it's just leading them there. Once they're there, they eventually do start to drink, because they kind of get, oh, I see, this is good for me. I will do it now. Yeah, for sure. But getting there is sometimes you got to kind of be patient. You got to pause for a while and say, okay, yeah, you want to look at the pretty flowers for a moment. That's cool. You want to choose some grass. Great. Okay, finally, I'm equating developers and engineers to horses. So hopefully nobody will take offense to that, but in the nicest possible way. Honestly, I mean it. It's not like I'm trying to
I
hurt
think
guys.
you make such a good point though with like experimenting with different ways of doing the messaging, because as you said, like you can't just keep repeating the same thing and then hoping that people are going to get it.
Yeah,
You have to come up with different ways of saying it, and another thing that you and I have discussed before also is you can't tell them that they have an ugly baby. You can't say
that's right.
your thing sucks, my
Yes,
way is better deal, because people will get very offended, rightfully so. So you have to be very tactful in your messaging.
exactly. And no, that's right, because they'll just take offense, and then they'll walk, and then everything you say afterwards, it falls on deaf ears. So
Yeah.
you don't want to attack them. You've got to draw them out. And we wear a lot of different hats in this role when it comes to observability. I feel it's not just about knowing how to do it technically. It's about how to assisting folks to see how they can learn from it and grow with it too. And that is a huge challenge. I That's why I've done like a lot of my videos. I've done too. Not too many of them have been exposed publicly. I've done them internally at work, but I would put on different characters. Like I would honestly like do different characters to help people understand, just so they have something. So it's not just another boring. Oh, here we go. Get told off about monitoring observability. Blah. Yes, we know, Dan. Logs are not monitoring. Okay. Yeah, it's like, but I try to build it up so it kind of resonates a little bit because they're more engaged because, oh, Dan's put on a funny wig and he's making a funny voice. But that point he made actually does make sense. So then, it starts to click eventually. I hope. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they just look at me and laugh and just walk away and nothing, nothing sinks in.
I like that though, because you're also like putting on different personas, right? And I think
Yeah.
people also like different personas resonate with different people. They have to at the end of the day, it's got to be how does this benefit me, right? Because
Yeah.
otherwise, if they don't see where they fit into all this, then it's falling on deaf.
Yeah. Exactly. How does it benefit me? That's a good valid point. And it's getting them to see that there is a benefit to them. It's just like, all right, well, you just have to sort of showcase this several different times. Um, I know somewhere along the way I heard somebody say that when you're creating a message for your organization, you got to do it like 7 times in like different formats to get it so people all kind of get it and think about it and understand it. And I think that's got some truth to it, to be honest. Because even to this day, I'm still telling people, by the way, this is the reason why we're doing this, and you kind of go through that process. So, um, yeah, no, it's totally, totally true.
Yeah, and I think there's also the seeing is believing sort of thing to it too, which is like,
Oh, it
yeah,
always
okay, I
works.
understand how like open telemetry works in theory, right? But it's
Yeah.
not until you put it in practice and you instrument your code for the first time. And even if it's like I added a trace, I added a log, whatever, and then you see it go through the collector and into your observability backend, and you're like, what? My life is transformed. Just even
And then you
something,
go like, now what I do?
yeah, right? It's like you crave more, right? Like
Yeah,
give 'em a
yeah.
little taste.
Proof is in the pudding, as the saying goes, is a very, very true too, because I have seen a lot of success. Once you get the ball rolling, they start to implement something. And I've seen it over the years in different tooling. I think only once have I seen it not work, but that's only because that was more my arrogance than anything else. So I've dropped arrogance at the door after that and never did it again. Because I wanted to use a specific tool for the job and realized that that's not the way to approach it. Um, and that's the other thing too. As engineers, as leaders, technical leaders, we should never push a tool, in my opinion. I think we should always look at what the organization needs, what's the most important thing, the most value to the organization, and then making sure we have the right practices in place, the right standards in place, and that will eventually, then we can figure out what tooling we'll use after that. Tooling should be always the last thing you should decide on how you want to visualize or work with your data. That's just my 2 cents. I don't know how other people, that might cause problems, but who knows?
Now, here's a question for you along the lines of tooling, because we see this a lot in tech, where you've got like a team, they start using a tool, but then the corporate standard for tooling comes out. How do you how do you reconcile, the teams that are off doing their own thing with the corporate standard? Because sometimes it's really hard to get folks unstuck from that. You can try to force them, but
You're
some
never going
some
to
folks
force
are
them.
very adamant and passionate about the tooling that they use, right?
They are, and you know what you got to. I honestly, personally, that when it comes to that thing, is like, okay, try to get them to as long as they're following best practices, following industry standards, then you can only push so far. Like you can say, hey, listen, stop using this particular tool because it's archaic. It doesn't give you the same value for what you have. But and then you're going to have pushback. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are, even when everybody's on board, and you're going to get pushback because people want to do things their own way, right? There's always that kind of like, I know better, I know what I'm doing, and you have to be delicate, and you have to be patient, and you have to be tactful. Um, so it's better to just, I would say, just try to encourage them to use best practices and standards, but don't try to push them off a tool. I mean, if somebody higher up wants to make that decision and call them out on it, let them do it. But I think it's more important to have the standards in place because if you can kind of tie everything together and you have a proper process flow and everybody still can get to the root of the cause of the issue, then and that's better than just saying you need to use X for your stuff moving forward, tough noogies, because that kind of thing doesn't work either, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially like, I'd almost prefer to like, okay, you use whatever observability backend you want as long as we're all instrumenting with OpenTelemetry. I feel like that is That
That's the
is the
bar.
main thing. Yeah, that is the
Yeah.
bar,
Yeah.
exactly. Now, when you joined your organization, was Top Hat doing observability at the time? What was the landscape like at the time?
So at that time, we were not, but we were. So this is one of those things where I kind of like I have to be very patient. But they were like when I first joined, we were using a vendor. Everything was there was instrumentation in place, there was logging in place, there were well, I should say there was traces in place, there was logging in place. They were linked, but they weren't. Um, it was done. Like they initially was rolled out about 5 years ago, but no other real work was done. Just kind of building on what they already knew moving forward. I was asked to come on and actually take the company off the vendor and migrate to OpenTelemetry. So that was 2.5 years ago. And we are almost there. Like this is, I think we have one more service to migrate over to OpenTelemetry this month, and then we're done. So it's taken almost about 2.5 years to kind of get to this point.
Amazing.
Is take Yeah, it was hard, obviously, but it was challenging. It had to be a lot of patience involved. Um, and what I did though in the beginning was actually kind of go back to remember the when we were at Monorama together, I did a talk on alerting. And I did that talk because I kind of was that was a precursor to where I really wanted to go, which is actually getting to SLOs. Right. But that was sort of like here's how you can first sort of understand your landscape when it comes to alerts and why. So and if you can categorize them in a certain way and realize a bulk of them are a lot of noise and doesn't have any value, help people start seeing those things in that kind of light, and then start showing the value of using service level objectives and how that can actually help with end user journeys, help actually bring the user experience home to the developer so they understand, okay, I don't need to alert on, when the load balancer is hitting 5xx errors, when I should be alerting on whether or not the service is being impacted by that and how it's being impacted. And then, yeah, I mean, those 5xx errors are important, but where are they important? How is that impacting the user experience? If it's for some feature that we don't really care about yet, we don't care about the 5xx because we don't need to be alerted about that in the middle of the night. But anyway, this was how we were trying to get that process going. And then they start doing the migration. Okay, now that we know how our service should look, now we can do our instrumentation on that moving forward. So we've done start off a lot of instrumentation, but now we have those user journeys to reflect upon and go, okay, we're missing this function in our instrumentation. Let's make sure that's part of that because that impacts the user's experience. So yeah, so it's been a while, but we are getting closer and closer to getting over to OpenTelemetry. We've set a lot of service level objectives. Two of them have already helped out, like alerted us like 2 days before an incident actually happened. So we're already seeing some value in this. So it does, again, proof of this is in the pudding, right? And we're already seeing some of that. And it's it's created a lot of churn, but in a lot of like turmoil, a lot of folks were like, oh no, we're losing this. But they're seeing that they're getting more value out of how we're doing things moving forward. And they're able to query things better because they're able to have a more richer data available at their fingertips. So
Now, in terms of vendors, did you end up switching vendors from the one that you were using when you first came in, or?
So we had the one vendor we were using. We're
Mhm.
still on that same vendor. But as of the end of this month, we're no longer going to be using that vendor. We'll be on another vendor moving forward because we're pulling all their vendor specific SDKs out and we're just putting an OpenTelemetry in and we're doing that replacement. So it's kind of like now we're getting to the point where those OpenTelemetry SDKs are pointing to a different vendor for our visualization of data.
Cool, awesome. Um, all right, moving on. Yeah, so the next question I had is, now that you've gone through the exercise of, of doing the instrumentation. So actually around instrumentation, is there what's the instrumentation culture like at Top Hat? Is it because one thing that I've spoken about in the past is like it really instrumentation has to be the responsibility of the developers. Do you think that there is that attitude of developers instrumenting their own code where you're at?
Not as of yet. And the reason why, and this is nothing against anybody. So I hope anybody who's at Top Hats listening, don't take offense. I love you all. Um, no, but it's because we were kind of like, once we started getting going on this whole transition, we had a very short period of time. So there's been a few instances where staff engineers and principal engineers have stepped in and done some of the work, or have laid the groundwork for the other teams, and they kind of just flipped over things and did things. The most effort they put in was actually in the user journeys themselves. So the auto instrumentation has been largely been kind of like, we've removed this, put this in, and they've kind of done it. So they haven't really, it hasn't part of been ingrained in part of their cultural thinking yet. It's still largely kind of like a checkbox for them to sort of, okay, we've moved, we migrated to OTel, job done, move on to something else. And little do they know that there's a lot more work involved, but don't scare them off yet, because it will help them. But it is something that has to be, I think, and we've tried to do is try to make it so as easy as possible, less, not as impacting as far as their day-to-day life, but try to slowly get them to start looking at things. And so going over things and saying, and using the tooling that we have available, saying, here, we know you did it in this particular tool. This is how you should do it in this tool, and providing that data, and then doing training on that too. So I'm trying, so it's slowly becoming part, but I would not say it's 100, like it's far from 100% yet. It's still, there's a lot of work to still be done there, just so they start to, they all understand why it's part of the value, right?
Yeah.
It's only like, I think right now it's still a handful, and I could be wrong. Maybe I might get in from Slack later. I'll get, told, no, we all love it. Who knows? I'm
And
hoping yes.
in terms of instrumentation, like what languages are part of like your application landscape? And
Mostly Python.
oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So as
Mostly. So what's that?
oh, I was gonna say, and you alluded to some auto instrumentation there.
Yeah, so we did on instrumentation in our Python code. And so we use a couple different frameworks, but I think we're just trying to work towards getting to one framework. And then yes, it's fortunately there's not like, so when it comes to, so you can actually almost kind of get away with, it's like doing a wrapper sort of library for people and have them just use that, and then
Yeah,
and that's kind of what we did. We had this little wrapper library set up that uses OTel with the, all the different things that they need to pull in there. And people just kind of just dumped it in and did auto instrumentation away they went. So they
yeah,
kind of like it. So it's kind of like all done for them. And they just kind of include this in the way they go. Um, but I think as we progress, it's going to be like, okay, let's start target. This is my next stage. Will be talking to, first off, the PMs, talking to them. Okay, this is what we have so far. These are the gaps we have in our telemetry data. These are the SLOs we have set so far. Let's decide on how that should look, because your team needs to own this. Your team needs to act on this. So when your error budget gets exhausted, your team needs to take that on in the next sprint. And that's one of the, and it like, so that, and again, the technical side is not that difficult. It's the cultural change, the process change that requires a lot of effort, right? Because now you have to get people to say, okay, well, instead of when we burn through our error budget, we need to deal with this in the next sprint. Well, that's usually, well, that or this feature that we need to push out. Which one do we do? And so, but they have to, that's what I said when I first started this, was that you have to agree upon this process. You have to think about, you are making a contract with the company to say, yeah, we will act on these SLOs because they will impact the user journey. They will impact our users. And that's what's most important to us today. So for those who are not aware, Top Hat is an educational platform. So what our users are teachers or professors and students. So imagine, if they're taking an exam and then everything goes sideways, that's gonna be really, I mean, imagine, anybody who has kids or has been to university knows that that could be a huge frustrating factor when you're not, if that's not working properly. So yeah, so that it's important that, oh, I did get a message. Somebody did tell me we all love it. Thanks, Mark. Uh, yeah. So, yeah. Now I just kind of get completely thrown off there. What was I talking about? ADHD in school?
You were talking about the SLOs and how frustrating it is if the consumers of your platform if it's not working as they expected.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that's this kind of fundamental shift that's going to SLOs and helping them see that and get through that. Yeah, because I think now I just went off the rails. So anyway, but that's all good.
Cool.
Worse things have
I have
happened.
one more question that I wanted to ask, and then we actually do have some questions from
You see
folks
that?
on our board, which I'm very excited about. Final question. I guess they two questions, I guess. Are you if are you using Kubernetes? And if so, are you using the OTel operator to manage your collectors and to manage
No,
your auto instrumentation? No?
no. Yeah. So I'm glad we're not. Just because, and this is not because I think that Kubernetes has its place in like all tools has its place. And I think for what we're doing today, it would not make sense. It would add a layer of complexity that would completely destroy our service. So I'm glad we're not using Kubernetes. I don't think that's not saying that there's anything wrong with Kubernetes. I just think that if you're going to run a Kubernetes environment, you need to know it.
Yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely.
right. And so if you don't know what you're doing with Kubernetes, you can really, really mess up your service. And I've been at places where we only had one or two people who knew Kubernetes, and we had a number of problems always with our clusters. So when we're ready though, I think we'll probably make that push. But right now we're just in containers. So
Oh,
it's all
okay.
just through, yeah, just containers, but not a Kubernetes. Yeah.
Gotcha,
So
gotcha. So you're
yeah,
using like another container management service, like a
yeah.
cloud provided one kind of thing?
A cloud provided container service. Yes.
Gotcha,
Yes.
gotcha,
We're
gotcha.
trying to avoid all names
Yeah,
of vendors right now.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Let's be
Fair,
vendor
very
agnostic.
fair. And final question before we get to the questions. Collectors, what's your collector landscape like?
So we're using a combination of OTel collector as a sidecar and then to a primary one that aggregates it. And then for our traces, we use with one company that where we're moving towards. They have their own collector that we send our traces to that we can do additional sampling rules on and send off. So
Oh,
yeah,
cool.
yeah. So right now, because I really, really love the fact that you could do send from code itself. But I love the OTel collector because you have these processors, you have these exporters, and you can send to different places as you see fit. I've had conversations with our data team saying, hey, listen, if you want stuff, OTel's collecting a lot of this, right? And we don't have to send all of it to for production, like as far as what we're looking at, as far as like would give us an idea of the user experience. But there may be things you are collecting from OTel that we can send to an S3 bucket that you can pull in later for whatever you needed. However, um, we still haven't gotten to that point, but that's the beauty of the OTel collectors that you can kind of like just point to different things. And I love that because then there's no code change. So if we decide we no longer want to use this, or we want to add logging, or we want to add we start using. Well, we don't use Prometheus now. But let's say we start using Prometheus
Mhm.
as a open source tool. As an example, though, we can easily just start getting that information right off the mark. So I just, if anything, try not to use the sampling and the OTel push from this code itself. Use a collector because I love the fact that because it makes life so much easier. Then you can just if you have to do little tiny changes or tweaks to your sampling or whatever, you don't have to go push it out to like the production environment again. It's just a small change on your collectors themselves, which makes life so much easier. That's just how I think of it.
Absolutely. And you're using all three like major signals, traces, logs, metrics right now, like for OTel or
Mostly traces right now.
okay.
So there was a decision to not do so metrics. We still are capturing the infrastructure metrics from the cloud, and the logs are primarily staying in our cloud provider. So all of our services are just logging by default from the container to the logging in our cloud provider, and they are
Gotcha.
staying there for the time being. Um, because that was another thing to start tackling, and I felt like that'd be too much for folks as they're transitioning from the one vendor to OpenTelemetry for them to like get their heads wrapped around would be like, oh, well, by the way, you also need to have structured logs too. And this is how you should do it. And no, this is just it'll make more confusion. And so I figured just focusing on one and then adding things as they go along, as they prove useful. So yeah, that's how we kind of approach that whole process.
Makes sense. Baby steps.
Exactly.
Cool. Okay, so we're gonna turn to the board, and if you want, you can take a peek at the questions. They're on the chat window. There's a link to the board.
Yep.
Folks can take a look. So, let's have a look at the questions. So the first one is, what is your opinion on telemetry on telemetry quality as a way to reduce spend? Is more data always better observability? Great question.
Awesome question. And that's a tough one. I don't think I hope I can answer that. In my opinion, um, it's about quality is you need to actually, because it really at the end of it, because you can have a bunch of things going through, but if you're sort of so let's just take a standard trace, right? If you have a bunch of spans in there that are doing sort of some things that you really know it's just back and forth, and you really like there's I've noticed some places where there's just there's I forget what it's called, and I wish I had a sample of the code before. It's been like 2 weeks ago. One of our engineers cleaned this up, and what he did though is he looked and realized we're making these calls in the code that we're adding span events to, and we don't need to, because so you're looking at the quality there, and this you're seeing what's invaluable and what's not. So more data doesn't always mean better telemetry. Quality data means better telemetry. So, in my opinion, you've got to look at what you're getting, making sure does that reflect the user experience. If it doesn't reflect the user experience, or is not exposing things where you would say, oh, like that's kind of like the concept of the unknowns, right? Like you're exposing those unknowns. If you're not able to see those things, and then you're not the quality. It doesn't matter how much you have. If you're not seeing that stuff, then it doesn't mean you're. It's the quality of the data that's most important, and that will help you reduce spend because then you know what's good. You can sample that partially out, and you're going to make sure that the error-prone things bubble up and become more apparent when you're looking at your data. Hopefully, that answered the question.
Yeah, that was a really great answer. Yeah, and I agree with you. It's really like, what's the point of capturing in telemetry for your system that's useless to you? Like, that's
Yeah,
just no.
yeah,
And I think that's a pitfall that a lot of people run into also with auto instrumentation initially, right? Because there's a lot of stuff coming in, and then and fortunately now I think there's a way to actually switch off auto instrumentation for certain libraries so that
yeah.
you can really zero in on the stuff that's super meaningful to you. So yay.
Yay!
Cool. Okay, next question. How do you approach the what to instrument and how much to instrument questions with your teams?
So that kind of is a link to the previous question, in my opinion, um, because what to instrument is again goes back to this. So I went through the whole process of working with the teams, the development teams, and the product teams to understand what the user journey looks like. So I went through and said, okay, what is the so we did the user journey. We looked at their service, and I asked them this. Like some did more than others, but more or less, it was like I asked them, what are the typical interactions a user would have your service, and write it down, and then write in plain language, and then in plain language describe the technically what's happening in the background. And then we also talk about the prerequisites of what people expect when they interact with that system. So they have to be logged in, they have to have this maybe this cookie or this cache or whatever. And then what are the dependencies? And then we just kind of work through and go, okay, what are the things that where a user will potentially see problems based on this information? And we went through all that. So that's how I kind of approach what to instrument. Because then once you kind of know, okay, so we know that user logs in, so they know they have to do that they have to interact with maybe uh, let's hypothetically say they interact with a database, they interact with an authorization service, maybe they interact with something in the back end for something else, another database. And so all these queries are checked in there. Now that all those things, all those functions are like talking to these different things, if they don't work means they can't log in. Therefore, we have key spots what they should be mostly looking at to make sure. There are always going to be times where people miss things. This is why we have the SLOs. This is why we have to have this constant part of our cycle to go back and making sure that those things are identified. So, you know, we're having problems with our service, but we don't know why. That means maybe you're not instrumenting. So what that means you have to revisit some of the things you did because maybe you did some changes that no longer uses this kind of database, maybe it uses maybe a cache service or uses a Redis cluster instead of these things. And so does your code or your user journey reflect that change? And does your instrumentation reflect that change? And if not, let's make sure they do. So, but it always boils down to the user journey and what the user is experiencing. If as long as we're capturing that, you're like 80% of the way, in my opinion, 80% of the way there, because you at least have a general idea. But you have to know. You have to have that conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, next question in the queue. In an org that has adopted distributed tracing, how do you make individual teams leave behind their outdated practices based on logs? How do you show value? That was a spicy question.
That's a spicy one. You slap them around and tell them what for. No, you do not. That's not the way to do things. You have to
Don't
be
call
very
their
kind
baby
and love.
ugly.
Exactly. That's number one. Do not call their baby ugly. Um, that's a tough one because you really have to be patient. And there's sometimes you do have to say, okay, listen, this has been dictated by the higher ups that we're doing this. And you try to offer them as much help as possible, but you got to find out too why they're reticent about switching over. Having these conversations is important because then you understand how they're looking at things, and then you can restructure your discussions around that. I like using logging because I get to see immediately when I'm doing my development. I can see it point out on the screen. I know where things are broken, so I can go back and fix it. Blah blah blah. And that's why they love logging as an example. So how do you have to then help them bridge that gap and say, okay, well, this is how you would do it with tracing. And this is why you would probably want to do it, because then with distributed tracing, you're not just getting the value out of your service, but you're seeing how service A interacted with your service B, and how service B is going to interact with service C, and how all that kind of works together. So this is why you want to have these pieces in the puzzle so you can get that full picture. But it takes time, it takes patience, and again, going back to one of the things we talked about before, restructuring how you approach the challenge of switching over. It's not just repeating yourself the same words over and over again, because eventually people are just going to tune you out. Like at my work, I think they tune me out half the time.
Okay, final question. We can squeeze it in hopefully in 2 minutes. Really love what you said about the tooling is the last thing you should think about, and that you should lead with the question, what is most important to your organization? What are some of the questions you ask to understand what is most important to someone's organization?
It's always about the user. In my opinion, it's always about the user. Um, because you're looking at, if the user's not happy and you can't measure that or you don't know that, then you're in trouble, right? And I always use streaming services like video streaming services as an example, because everybody has tuned into one of many of these streaming services we have now today. So if you pull up a movie, you push play, and it gets all pixelated for the first 3 seconds, and then it clears up after that. Do you care? No. So if a person comes, but does no the streaming service know that? They probably are measuring that because they want to make sure that that doesn't become a bigger issue, because they know that runway of where you're okay to where you're not okay. And you're going to get frustrated and go, I'm going to go switch to this now because they have better quality. And so it's always about what the user, are we measuring the user experience? Do we know what the user experience is like? Do we know what frustrates them? And if we don't, how do we get there? And that's how we get. So that is usually with the tooling that we have available to us today with the SDKs and other things, and the philosophies we have. And eventually then you can go, because you know what, the tools comes out all the time. There's so many tools out there that the landscape has gotten bigger and bigger as people become more and more involved, but doesn't necessarily mean they're all good. And but you have to find the one that kind of works for you at the time. And this is why we like OpenTelemetry, is because you can switch from one to the other with very minimal change. And that's why I like about getting people on OpenTelemetry. But when it comes to the tooling, that should be your last thing to think about. Don't build your solution around the tooling you spot. Build your solution about what your users are thinking. And that's how, and I think a lot of people, that resonates when you start talking in that light, especially with the higher ups. Anyway, so I think we got them all in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we got through all the questions. Yay! We filled up
Yay!
this hour quite nicely. So thank you so much, Dan, for joining us for OTel Q&A. Stay tuned for our next OTel Q&A and or OTel in practice. And again, thank you, Dan, for joining today. Really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. You know how much I love talking about these things. So, I think I actually did not go down a rabbit hole today. I think I did pretty good.
It's perfect. It was great. Thank
Yay.
you
All
again.
right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you
All
for
right,
showing up.
bye.
See ya.